Somewhere in the middle of the English night, long before any light touches the horizon, the monastery lies still. The stone buildings rest in a darkness that is complete and unhurried, a darkness that has settled slowly over the course of many hours, thickening as the last of the evening's candles were extinguished one by one, and the community climbed the dormitory stairs in silence. The church stands at the heart of the precinct, its walls pale gray against a sky of deeper gray, its narrow windows holding no light at all. Around it, connected by the covered walkways of the cloister, the other buildings of the community extend in orderly arrangement: the chapter house, the refectory, the warming room, the dormitory running along the eastern range above the cloister walk. All of them are still now. All of them rest beneath a sky in which, on a clear night, the stars are very many and very bright, and the cold air carries nothing but quiet. Inside the dormitory, the monks of the community lie sleeping on their straw pallets, arranged in a long row down the length of the room, each man in his habit. For Benedictine custom as set out in the rule requires that they sleep fully clothed and girded, ready to rise without delay when the bell calls them. The room is cold in the way that stone rooms in England are cold through the long months of winter, and even into early spring, a cold that settles into the walls and the floor and rises gently through the night toward the sleeping bodies above. And yet the wool blankets drawn over each monk are thick and have been used through many seasons, and the closeness of so many sleeping bodies in one long room creates a warmth that is modest but real, a shared warmth that belongs to the community as much as any prayer or labor does. The breathing of the monks fills the dormitory with a sound that is very soft and very even. One man breathes more slowly than another. One shifts beneath his blanket, turning slightly on the narrow pallet, and then is still again. The straw beneath the rough linen rustles faintly with the movement, and then falls quiet. Along the row, the breathing continues, slow and collective, the sound of deep and genuine rest earned through a day of prayer and work and reading and prayer again. The stone walls on either side of the dormitory are thick, as monastery walls generally are, and they hold both the cold and the quiet with the same steadfast patience, the way stone that has stood through many generations will do. A narrow window set high in the eastern wall admits a faint draught, cool and clean, that moves almost imperceptibly through the room without disturbing anything, touching the edge of a blanket here, the still air near a sleeping face there, and then dispersing into nothing. Through that same narrow window, the stars are visible, small and numerous, and entirely indifferent to the hours of the night passing below them. At one end of the dormitory, or in some monasteries along a passage adjacent to it, a single small lamp burns. It is an oil lamp, simple and well used, its flame no larger than a man's thumbnail, steady in the still air. This lamp belongs to the cantor, or in some communities to the monk appointed as night watchman, the brother whose task it is to keep the hours through the night, to measure the slow turning of darkness, and to know with reasonable precision when the moment has come to ring the bell for matins. He sits or stands in the small pool of light that the lamp makes, close enough to it for the faint warmth it gives, and he tends it with careful attention, for the flame must not be allowed to gutter and fail. Every so often he adjusts the wick with a small tool kept for the purpose, and the flame rises and steadies again, and the pool of light on the cold stone floor remains constant. The cantor who keeps this watch has done so many times. It is a familiar duty, as the nights of the monastic year are in many ways familiar, one following another in the same order, the same darkness, the same cold, the same eventual yielding of night toward the first pallor of dawn. He is practiced in the reading of the night's hours, whether by the turning of a water clock if the house possesses one, or by the slow movement of familiar stars through that narrow window, or simply by long experience of lying dark and still and learning the feel of each hour as it deepens and passes. He knows that the hour for matins is not yet come. He knows also that it is not far. The lamp throws his shadow large and wavering against the wall behind him. He is a still figure, not restless, not impatient. The duty of waiting, of tending the lamp and keeping the hours, is itself a form of prayer in the long theology of monastic life, a quiet offering made in the dark while the brothers sleep. He breathes slowly. He does not move more than he must. Outside, the precinct is entirely quiet. The low buildings of the kitchen and the bakehouse stand dark and cool, their fires banked for the night. The herb garden within the cloister Garth holds its orderly beds of sage and rue and lavender in the darkness, the plants still and silvery where a little starlight reaches them through the open square of sky above the cloister. The church, the largest and tallest of all the buildings, seems to absorb the darkness rather than merely endure it, its stone interior awaiting the community with the patience of a thing that has awaited them through every night of many generations. The wooden choir stalls stand empty in the dark. The altar cloth is a pale shape at the far end. Nothing moves. The cantor looks toward the window or toward the water clock, and he sees that the time has come. He rises from his place, and the lamp goes with him, its small flame moving through the dark passage, casting brief moving shadows on old stone. He reaches the bell rope. His hand closes around it, and for one final moment the monastery rests in its entirety, every sleeping monk unaware that the night is about to change, every stone wall holding its silence for the last few seconds before sound arrives. And then the bell begins to ring, clear and measured, filling the dark air of the precinct from the tower above, rolling out across the rooftops and the garden and the fields beyond, calling the community back from sleep, back to the long, familiar, gently ordered hours of prayer that have structured this day and every day before it, and will structure all the days that follow. The bell does not hurry. It sounds at its own measured pace, each stroke falling into the cold air and then dissolving slowly before the next arrives. And in the dormitory above the church, the monks begin to stir from their wool blankets and their straw pallets with the calm resignation of men long accustomed to this particular summons. There is no startled waking here, no confusion about what the sound means or what must follow. The body of a monk who has lived by the canonical hours for many years comes to wakefulness the way a familiar path comes underfoot, without surprise, without resistance, in the quiet knowledge of where it leads. They rise in the darkness without lighting individual candles, for the night stairs are known to them in a way that requires no additional light. A single lamp may burn at the head of the stair, or the cantor who rang the bell may carry his flame back through the passage, but the monks themselves move by memory and by touch, their feet finding each worn stone step with the ease of long repetition. They are wrapped still in their habits, for Benedictine custom in many houses required that monks sleep fully clothed and girded, ready to rise without delay for the night office. Some draw their cowls a little closer against the cold. A sandal is fastened quietly in the dark. Then the long, silent filing descent begins. The night stairs lead from the dormitory directly into the south transept of the church, and stepping through the doorway at the bottom is to move from the relative shelter of the monks' quarters into the full cold of a stone building that has been sitting open and unheated through the depths of the night. In winter months this cold is considerable. It settles against the face and hands with a still, clear sharpness, and the first breath drawn inside the church becomes briefly visible as a faint pale cloud before it disappears. The monks file into their places in the choir without speaking, for the silence of the night office is one of its defining qualities, a silence that is not emptiness, but something more like expectation. The choir occupies the eastern portion of the nave and the area before the high altar, and it is divided into 2 rows of stalls facing one another across a central space. These stalls are of heavy wooden construction, each one fitted with a hinged seat that, when raised, reveals on its underside a small projecting ledge called a misericord, against which a monk may lean during the long hours of standing. The wood has been smoothed by years of contact with wool and skin. The stalls are tall enough that a monk seated within one is partially enclosed, the carved sides rising above shoulder height, and this gives each place a quality of sheltered quietness, even within the larger space of the church. In the darkness before the office begins, the monks stand at their places, and the small sounds of their settling, the fold of fabric, the creak of an ancient joint in the woodwork, the soft movement of a sandal on stone, gradually cease until the church is very nearly silent. The candles on the altar and at the lectern provide most of the light in the church during Matins. They are not numerous, and their flames, still and small in the absence of any draught, cast a warm, limited glow that does not reach the high vaults above or the furthest corners of the aisles. The altar cloth catches the nearest candlelight and holds it softly. The stone of the columns and the carved capitals above them recede into shadow. What the candlelight does illuminate, it illuminates with a particular gentleness, the kind of light that seems to ask nothing of the eye and which allows the mind to remain in the half-waking state appropriate to an office sung in the middle of the night. Matins in the Benedictine tradition is the longest of the canonical hours, especially when it falls on a Sunday or a major feast, and it is structured with a careful and repeated architecture of psalms, antiphons, lessons, and responses. The office begins when the officiant intones the opening versicle, and at this signal, the two sides of the choir take up their parts in the antiphonal chant that forms the backbone of the night prayer. One side of the choir chants a verse of the psalm, and then the other side takes it up, and this slow alternation moves through the whole of the psalm, and then pauses before the next begins. The chant itself is not dramatic in character. It does not seek to create emotion so much as to sustain attention, to carry the words of the ancient psalms on a melody that is simple enough to be repeated night after night for a lifetime, and still remain fresh in its quietness. The sound of the chant in a stone church at 3 a.m. has a particular quality that arises from the combination of voices, space, and silence. The voices of the monks, still soft from sleep, rise from the choir stalls and travel upward into the vaulted ceiling, where the stone gathers the sound and returns it slightly changed, with a faint resonance that makes each phrase seem to linger a moment longer than the breath that produced it. Between the verses there are intervals of complete silence, and in these intervals, the cold and the candlelight and the stone all seem to be held very still, as though the building itself is attending. Then the chant begins again, low and measured, the syllables of the Latin psalms falling one after another with a steadiness that does not rush and does not falter. The lessons read between the nocturnes are drawn from Scripture or from the writings of the Church Fathers, and they are read aloud from the lectern by whichever monk has been assigned to that role. The reader stands alone in the candlelight, while the rest of the community listens from their stalls, and his voice moves through the text carefully, without haste, pausing where the sense requires it, returning the words to silence when each lesson is complete. After each lesson a responsory is sung, the choir taking up its part in a pattern that has been rehearsed and repeated so many times that it has become as natural as breathing. The office of Matins flows without interruption into Lauds, the two offices together forming a single long vigil of prayer that bridges the deepest part of the night and carries the community through to the first signs of morning. By the time Lauds begins, the darkness at the narrow windows of the church may be showing its first, faintest yielding, a quality in the black that is not yet gray, but has perhaps lost some of its absolute density. The monks, who have been standing in their stalls for an extended time, have settled into the posture of endurance that is itself a kind of prayer, the body present and upright, the mind moving along the familiar channels of the chant, the cold accepted without complaint, the warmth of the other voices in the choir, a kind of companionship that requires no words. Lauds, whose name derives from the psalms of praise that are its heart, carries a slightly different quality from the long night watches of Matins. There is in it a sense of emergence, of movement toward the light, and the psalms appointed for Lauds speak of morning and of waking, and of the goodness of the day that is beginning. The voices in the choir carry these words with the same evenness that has characterized the whole of the night office, but beneath the evenness there is something that might be described as orientation, a gentle turning of the community's collective attention toward what is coming. When the final prayer of Lauds is sung, and the last note fades into the stone vaults above, the monks stand for a moment in the hush that follows, and then, in the same quiet order in which they descended, they begin to make their way back through the cold church. The candles on the altar continue to burn, small and patient, in the space the community has left behind. The pale shape at the high windows is perhaps a little less purely dark than it was an hour before. The day, still some time distant, is nonetheless on its way, and the monastery has already met it with its first long offering of prayer. In certain monasteries, and in certain seasons, the return from Lauds does not lead immediately into the next duty of the day. There is instead a small gift of time, a brief window in which the community is permitted to climb once more to the dormitory and lie down upon their straw pallets, drawing the wool blankets back around shoulders that have grown cold in the church. It is not a deep sleep that comes in these intervals, not the long surrender of the first part of the night, but something lighter and more tentative, a partial rest in which the body recovers a little of its warmth, and the mind drifts in the shallow water between waking and true sleep. The monks lie in the long dormitory as the darkness outside the narrow windows very slowly, almost imperceptibly, begins to change its character. The blankets carry the scent of lanolin from the wool, and beneath that, faintly, the particular smell of the straw mattresses, dry and dusty and familiar. A monk settling back onto his pallet might arrange himself much as he was arranged before the night bell rang, on his side, hands folded, breathing slowing again toward calm. The dormitory is a long room with timber roof beams overhead, and a row of narrow windows, set high in the stone walls on both sides. In the full dark of matins those windows showed nothing, or perhaps the faintest smear of gray cloud or pale star. Now, as this second interval of rest draws on, something different begins to gather in them. It is not yet color, not yet anything that could properly be called light, but a gradual and gentle loosening of the absolute darkness, as though the night were softening at its edges. Some monks sleep again, and some do not. Those who remain in the quiet shallows of half-waking awareness lie still nonetheless, their breathing slow, their bodies grateful for the horizontal and the warmth. The dormitory around them holds its nighttime quiet, broken only by the deep, even breath of those who have slipped back more fully into sleep, and perhaps the faint settling sound of the timber roof, as the first suggestion of morning cool gives way to the first suggestion of something fractionally less cold. It is an almost imperceptible transition, registered in the body rather than the mind, a shift in the quality of the darkness, a sense that the long night is beginning at last to yield. When the bell sounds again for prime, there is a particular character to the rising that differs from the first waking at matins. At matins, the sleeper must come from a great depth, drawn upward through layers of genuine sleep, the body slow and the mind gradual to form itself. The rising for prime, by contrast, happens from a shallower place, and though the body is still stiff, and the stone floor cool beneath bare feet, the movement from rest to standing carries a kind of early morning clarity. The dormitory stirs all along its length, shakes sitting upright, feet finding the floor, hands reaching for the woolen habit. The rule of many Benedictine houses held that monks should sleep fully clothed and girded, ready to rise without delay, and so the habit is already in place, perhaps straightened or smoothed before the descent begins. The night stairs are descended again, but the monks do not go directly to the church. The custom of the morning washing draws them first toward the lavatorium, the stone basin or trough, set into the cloister wall near the entrance to the refectory, fed by a lead pipe that brings water from a cistern, or from a nearby source. The water is cold. In the winter months it is very cold indeed, carrying the temperature of stone and earth and the long night air, and a monk cupping it in his palms and bringing it to his face would feel it as a clear and bracing sensation, one that sharpens the senses gently and settles the awareness before the office. The skin of the hands and face responds to it with a quiet wakefulness that no gradual warming could quite produce. The sound of water at the lavatorium is one of the characteristic sounds of the early monastic morning. It moves with a gentle continuity, a soft and steady sound against stone, as one monk after another steps forward, washes, and steps away. The stone basin itself is worn smooth at its rim, where countless hands have rested across the years. The water collects briefly and runs away through a drain cut in the floor, and the stone around it is always cool and faintly damp to the touch. A small cloth might be used to dry the face and hands, folded and set aside, and then the monk draws himself together for the office to come. The cloister Garth lies open to the sky through the arched arcade, and as the monks move through the cloister walk toward the church, the light gathering in that open square of ground is now unmistakably the light of approaching dawn. It is pale and without warmth, a gray-white luminescence spread evenly across the sky above the Garth, rather than arriving from any single direction. The grass of the Garth, where it grows in the enclosed square, holds the night moisture still, and the low herbs of any garden beds edging the walls are dark and still in the early air. The stone of the arcade itself, which a few hours earlier was entirely colorless in the lamplight, now begins to reveal its actual texture. The grain of the blocks, the fine moss at the mortar joints, the slight variation in color from one stone to the next. Sandals on flagstone carry softly through the cloister, a measured and deliberate sound as the community moves toward the church door. The breath of the monks is visible in the cold air, faint plumes rising and dispersing, each monk enclosed in his own small cloud of warmth for a moment, before it is absorbed into the wider cold. The church, when entered, holds the stillness of the early hour, the altar candles from the previous office perhaps renewed, or simply continuing their patient burning, the choir stalls waiting in their familiar arrangement. The office of Prime is brief in comparison to the long vigil of Matins and Lauds. Its psalms are fewer, its character is of a consecration of the new day. A quiet, formal acknowledgement that the hours now beginning are offered to their purpose. The voices of the monks settle into the familiar rhythm of versicle and response, and the sound rises again into the vaulted ceiling above them, joining all the other mornings on which the same words have been sung in this same place. Outside the high windows, the sky continues its slow brightening, and the monastery, having watched through the night and greeted the dawn with prayer, moves forward now into the day's first full light. When Prime is complete, the monks do not immediately disperse to their separate tasks. There is a brief and quiet movement within the church, a settling of the community before it leaves together, and then the procession forms again, ordered by seniority as it always is, and passes out through the cloister walk toward the chapter house. The footsteps on the flagstone are measured and gentle, sandals worn smooth by years of this same passage, and the cold of the cloister Garth presses gently in from the open center, where the early light is now fully arrived, pale and clear, touching the stone columns with a thin winter gold. The chapter house lies along the eastern range of the cloister, its entrance a doorway of some care and craftsmanship, the arch above it cut from good stone and fitted with a pair of wooden doors worn dark with age and the oils of many hands. Passing through this doorway is a daily crossing of a particular threshold, a movement from the individual quiet of the morning into the gathered life of the community. The room beyond is vaulted, its ceiling rising from a central pillar or from corbels set into the walls, depending on the size and age of the house, and the space feels both enclosed and spacious, held together by the curve of stone above and the even arrangement of what lies below. Around the walls, stone benches are set in continuous rows, their surfaces worn smooth and somewhat hollowed by generations of monks who have sat in precisely these places before. In some houses, the seats are divided by low stone arms into individual stalls, each one a modest carved recess that gives each monk his own small portion of the room. The stone is cool to the touch even in milder seasons, and in winter, the monks draw their habits close and sit with the settled patience of men who have long since made peace with cold. At the far end of the room, set slightly apart, and perhaps raised upon a low step, the abbot's chair stands, broader than the benches, carved with a little more intention, though still plain by any worldly measure. It faces the assembled community, and in it the abbot sits with a quietness of authority that comes not from display, but from long acceptance and long service. Before anything of the day's business is spoken, there is reading. This is the shape the chapter meeting has always taken, its beginning given over not to governance or instruction, but to the listening ear. A monk appointed to this duty, often the cantor or a senior brother, rises and goes to the reading stand set toward the center of the room, where the great martyrology lies open, or is opened with careful hands. The martyrology is a large book, its pages thick and well handled, containing for every day of the year the names and brief accounts of those saints commemorated on that day. The reader finds the correct folio, smoothing the page gently with the flat of his hand, and then reads aloud in the measured tones that monastic reading requires, neither fast nor dramatically slow, but sustained and even, as though the words themselves ask for steadiness. The names come first, and they are many. The feast days of the saints are recorded in their geographical particularity, the city of their veneration, the province, the names of those associated with them, and the list of names can be quite long, before the brief account of their lives is reached. The monks listen without restlessness. This is the quality of attention that the monastic day cultivates in all its hours, not the sharp, acquisitive attention of a man seeking information, but the open, resting attention of one who allows what is read to pass through him like water through cloth, leaving something behind without effort or grasping. Some monks will have heard these same names in the same brief accounts dozens, perhaps hundreds of times, and the familiarity is itself a comfort, a repeated meeting with the same quiet presences year after year. After the martyrology, a passage from the Rule of Saint Benedict is read. The rule is divided such that it can be read through in its entirety over the course of the year, and each morning's chapter meeting takes its name, in part, from this practice. The chapter meeting being the meeting at which the chapter of the rule is read. The passage selected for the day may be brief or somewhat longer, covering one of the rule's carefully balanced prescriptions for how the life of the community is to be ordered. Benedict's words are old and plain, written in a Latin of great practical clarity, and they speak of obedience, of humility, of the proper ordering of the hours of prayer, of how guests are to be received, of how the abbot is to govern with wisdom and patience rather than with hardness of heart. The reader's voice gives these words the same even quality as it gave to the martyrology, and the vaulted ceiling accepts them as it accepts all sound in this room, dispersing and holding them at once. When the reading is done, the reader returns quietly to his seat, and the abbot speaks. What the abbot says may be very little, a brief reflection upon the passage just heard, or a few words that touch upon some matter of the community's spiritual life, or he may speak at somewhat more length if the occasion calls for it. His voice in this room carries the particular quality of a voice accustomed to being listened to, but it is not a commanding voice in any harsh sense. The rule itself instructs the abbot to be gentle with the weak and firm with the strong, to proportion his guidance to the character of each monk, and the best abbots have absorbed this counsel so thoroughly that it no longer requires effort, but simply expresses itself in the way they speak. After the abbot's words, the practical business of the day is taken up. The prior or the abbot himself may assign the day's work, which brothers are to labor in the kitchen garden, which are to assist the cellarer, which are to continue their work in the Scriptorium, which are needed in the infirmary or the guest house. These assignments are made without ceremony or elaboration, simply named and received, each monk noting his duty for the day with a quiet inclination of the head. In larger houses, the business may be somewhat more involved, touching on the management of the monastery's lands, the reception of visitors, or practical matters of maintenance and supply. All of it is conducted in the same register, calm, ordered, purposeful, and none of it seems to disturb the quality of stillness that the reading established at the beginning of the meeting. There is also, in many communities, a moment in the chapter meeting when a monk may acknowledge some fault or failing in his observance of the rule, a breach of silence, a moment of inattention in the choir, a small lapse in the order of daily life. The acknowledgement is made simply, with equanimity on all sides, and the abbot receives it and responds with whatever counsel or gentle correction seems appropriate. The practice is not one of shame, but of transparency, of maintaining the honesty that the community depends upon for its collective life. A fault acknowledged and released is lighter than one carried quietly, and the chapter meeting provides this opportunity as a regular and unremarkable part of its proceedings. When all the business has been concluded, the abbot gives a brief blessing or nod of dismissal, and the monks rise from the carved stone benches with the quiet movements of men who have been at rest and now return to motion. They file back through the dark wooden doors into the cloister, each turning toward his appointed work for the morning, the sounds of footsteps diverging gradually as the community separates into its various tasks. The chapter house stands behind them in its vaulted stillness, the martyrology resting on its stand, the abbot's chair empty again, the stone seats holding the faint warmth that the gathered community has briefly given them before the cool of the morning reclaims everything once more. Among those who leave the chapter house and move through the cloister walk, a small number turn toward a particular door on the eastern side, one that opens into a room somewhat quieter than the rest and somewhat more carefully ordered. This is the Scriptorium, and the monks who file into it carry with them the same composed manner they have worn since rising, though here that quietness takes on a particular quality, a focused stillness that settles over the room almost as soon as the last man has found his place. The Scriptorium is arranged to make the fullest use of whatever light the English morning is willing to give. The desks are positioned along the walls where the windows stand tallest, each narrow opening oriented to draw in the pale northward or eastward light that falls most evenly and causes the least shadow across the working surface. On a clear morning in late autumn or early spring, this light has a clean, cool quality that serves the eye well, falling without glare across the slanted surface of the writing desk, illuminating the cream and gray tones of the parchment without washing them into whiteness. On a gray and overcast morning, which is not uncommon in England through much of the year, the room is dimmer, and the monks work more carefully, leaning fractionally closer to their work, their eyes adjusting to what the day offers. Each desk is a simple thing, a board of smoothed wood set at an angle so that the parchment rests tilted toward the scribe, allowing him to work without bending his neck too far downward for long hours at a stretch. Beside the desk or resting on a narrow ledge built along the sill, each monk keeps the small assembly of tools that his work requires. There is a penknife, small and very sharp, used both for cutting quill pens and for scraping away errors on the parchment surface. There is a pumice stone for smoothing a rough patch or preparing a new section of the page. There is a small weight or a strip of lead to hold the parchment flat against the desk, since parchment, which is made from the scraped and dried skin of a sheep or calf, has a memory of its former shape and will curl slightly at the edges if left unsecured. The quills themselves require attention before the work of copying can properly begin. A monk who has been assigned to writing will often spend some part of the early morning seeing to his pens, selecting a primary feather from the small supply he keeps at his desk, holding it at an angle to the light to judge the condition of the tip, and then working at it with the penknife in small careful strokes. The cutting of a quill is a practiced skill, one that takes years to become second nature. The very end of the shaft is trimmed away, and then the tip is shaped into a narrow point with a short slit cut lengthwise along it, to allow the ink to flow in a controlled and steady stream. The angle and fineness of this cut will determine the width and character of every stroke that follows from it, so the monk takes his time, turning the quill, cutting a little more, testing the point against the pad of his finger before he is satisfied. A poorly cut pen makes the work harder, and so the preparation is treated as seriously as the writing itself. Ink is kept in a small vessel, set into a hole in the corner of the desk, or rested in a little stand, positioned close enough to dip the pen without awkward reaching, but not so close that a careless movement could overturn it. The ink used in the Scriptorium is most commonly made from oak galls, those small round growths that appear on oak trees where certain wasps have laid their eggs. Combined with iron salts and a binding agent such as gum arabic, added to give body and adhesion. The result is a liquid that begins brownish and darkens as it dries and oxidizes on the page, eventually settling into the deep, rich black that fills the letters of so many old manuscripts. It has a particular smell, faintly astringent, with a mineral sharpness underneath, and this scent drifts quietly through the Scriptorium all morning, mingling with the fainter smell of the parchment itself, which carries something of its animal origin, even after it has been scraped and stretched and dried. For a monk who has also been assigned some portion of the illumination work, there are additional preparations to consider. Pigments for the colored letters or the decorated borders at the beginnings of sections are kept in small shells or shallow stone dishes, each holding a particular color ground from its source material and mixed with a binding medium. The deep blue that appears in many manuscripts of this period came from lapis lazuli, a stone brought from very distant places, thought to have originated in the mountains of Central Asia, and therefore precious, used sparingly in only the most significant parts of a page. Other blues could be made from less costly materials. Reds came from lead compounds, or from kermes, a dye derived from small insects found in warmer parts of Europe, and long known to medieval craftsmen. Yellows from plant sources or from a mineral called orpiment. Greens from verdigris formed on copper. Each pigment must be ground to a fine smoothness, since even a small grain of undissolved material can cause the brush to catch and drag across the surface of the parchment. The grinding is done slowly, with a small stone against a flat surface, and the monk who does it moves through it with patience, working the pigment until it achieves the even, silky consistency that will flow properly from the brush. When the preparations are complete, and the monk settles fully into the work of copying, the room enters its deepest silence. There is no speech permitted in the Scriptorium during the working hours, and the monks communicate if they must by signs, a system of gestures that the community has developed to handle the small practical requests of the day without breaking the quiet. But for the most part, there is no communication at all. Each man is absorbed in his own portion of the text before him, working from an exemplar, an existing manuscript laid beside or above his blank page, reproducing letter by letter the words that his pen traces across the new parchment. The movement of the pen is slow and deliberate. The strokes that make up a single letter in a formal manuscript hand are not drawn in one flowing motion, but built up from several careful movements, each one placed with attention. The scribe lifts and repositions his pen between strokes, maintaining the consistent angle and pressure that the script requires. A well-formed page of manuscript script has a rhythm to it, an evenness of spacing and weight that only comes from this careful and repeated attention, letter following letter, word following word, line following line, ruled in faint lines across the parchment to keep the writing level. The ruling is done beforehand, usually scored lightly into the surface with a pointed instrument, or drawn in a pale ink that will not compete with the script above it. When an error occurs, the penknife is taken up and used with great care to lift the offending mark away. The blade is drawn very lightly across the surface of the parchment at a shallow angle, removing the ink a little at a time without cutting into the skin itself. The monk works at it patiently, perhaps finishing with a light rub of pumice to restore the smoothness before he dips his pen and continues. The correction made well is nearly invisible in the finished page. Throughout the morning, the sound in the Scriptorium is the sound of nibs moving across parchment, a dry and whispering scratch, and the occasional soft tap of a pen being set down, or the quiet grating of the pumice stone. These sounds carry through the room and settle into it, becoming part of its character in the way that the sounds of water and birds settle into the cloister Garth outside. It is not an unpleasant sound. There is something in the repeated, gentle scratch of many pens working in the same space that becomes almost soothing, the texture of industry that fills the air without disturbing it. The monks who sit at these desks come to this work with varying degrees of skill and seniority. Some are experienced scribes whose hands have shaped thousands of letters across hundreds of pages, and who move through the work with an ease that looks almost effortless, the pen flowing steadily, the eye moving back and forth between exemplar and page with practiced regularity. Others are younger or newer to the Scriptorium, working more slowly, perhaps producing fewer lines in the same span of time, but working no less carefully for that. The room holds them all in the same quiet, makes no distinction between the swift and the deliberate, values only the steadiness of attention that each man brings to his portion of the page. Outside the tall windows, the morning continues its slow passage, the light shifting almost imperceptibly as the sun moves behind its covering of English cloud. Inside, the Scriptorium remains steady, the cool air still, the smell of ink and parchment constant. The monks bend to their work and the parchment fills, one slow line at a time, with the words that have been entrusted to them for keeping, and the morning holds them in its gentle calm as the bell for the next hour waits quietly in the tower above. The bell, when it comes, arrives without urgency. It moves through the air above the monastery with the same measured patience it has always carried, each stroke falling at an even interval, the sound spreading outward from the tower and finding its way through stone walls and down corridors and in through the tall windows of the Scriptorium, where the monks have been bent over their work. The third hour has arrived, and with it the office of Terce, and the morning that has been flowing so quietly in one direction now pauses and turns, as a slow river turns around a wide bend. The monks in the Scriptorium set down their pens with care. A quill is not left resting across a wet line of ink, for the parchment must not be smeared. Each man ensures his work is safe before he stirs. Ink pots are stoppered if they risk being disturbed. A half-finished letter is left half-finished, and this causes no distress, because the desk will be there when Terce is done, and the parchment will be waiting, and the morning's work will continue exactly as it left off. There is a kind of trust in this, a confidence that the structures of the day will hold, that the bell for the next hour is not a disruption, but simply another part of the same long, unbroken rhythm. They file from the Scriptorium in silence, adjusting their cowls as they pass through the cooler air of the cloister walk, sandals moving quietly over the worn stone beneath them. From other parts of the monastery, other monks are converging by the same quiet pull. A brother who has been carrying sacks of grain from the outer storehouse pauses and sets his burden down and joins the stream moving toward the church door. Another who has been attending to a matter in the cellarer's office closes a ledger and follows. The cloister Garth, briefly visible through the open arcade, shows a pale mid-morning sky and the low green shapes of the garden at its center. Then the church receives them. Terce is a brief office. It does not carry the great depth of Matins with its long nocturnes, nor the solemnity of Vespers with its lamplit ceremony. It is shorter and gentler, a pause rather than a culmination, and its brevity is itself a kind of gift. A hymn is sung first, the voices of the community rising together in the stone interior, the melody well known to every man present, familiar enough that it requires no effort, only willingness. The psalms that follow are a small number, 3 or perhaps 4 depending upon the season, and they are chanted in the same alternating pattern that has been the mode of the office since the early centuries of the church, one side of the choir answering the other across the central aisle, the verses moving back and forth like a slow conversation between friends who have no need to raise their voices. The candles on the altar burn with their usual small steadiness. The light in the church has changed from the gray of early morning, and now, where a gap in the cloud allows it, a slant of cool white light falls from one of the high clerestory windows and touches the floor of the nave in a long pale rectangle, shifting so gradually that it cannot be seen to move. The monks stand in their choir stalls or kneel briefly when the prayer comes, and around them the church holds its enormous quiet in the spaces between the sung phrases, a quiet that is not emptiness, but a kind of fullness, as if the stone itself has been saturated over the years with all the prayers that have been offered within it, and now holds them in reserve. The versicle is said, the response is made, and a short prayer closes the office. The community stirs, and within a few minutes the church is emptying again, each monk moving back toward the work that the morning has assigned to him, carrying Terce with him, the way one carries warmth from a fire out into a cooler room, not as a feeling exactly, but as a quality of steadiness, a reminder of purpose. The infirmarian goes first to the infirmary, a long, low building on the eastern side of the precinct, set somewhat apart from the main cloister range, where several of the older brothers are resting or receiving care. He is a man of patient habit and considerable practical knowledge, trained in the understanding of herbs and their applications, and he moves through the infirmary with the calm assurance of someone who has performed the same acts of care many hundreds of times. He looks in on those who are resting, notes how one brother slept, and prepares a small preparation from dried herbs that have been stored in labeled pottery jars along a wooden shelf. The room smells of dried lavender and something faintly resinous, and the light through its windows is soft and even. The cellarer has returned to his accounts. He is responsible for the material provisioning of the entire community, the stores of grain and salt fish, the measures of ale, the supply of tallow for candles and wood for fuel, the condition of the granary and the mill arrangements, the agreements with tenants on the monastery's properties. He sits at a heavy wooden table in his office beside the storehouse, a bound ledger open before him, and he works through columns of figures with the methodical attention that his position requires. A lay brother appears at the door to report on the state of a particular storage bin, and the cellarer listens, asks a quiet clarifying question, makes a note in the margin of his page with a short reed pen, and nods to indicate that the matter is settled. Then both men return to their respective work without ceremony. In the kitchen, which stands slightly separated from the main buildings as a precaution against fire, the kitchener has begun the longer preparations for the midday meal. The fire in the great hearth has been built up to a steady and considerable heat, and water has been set to warm in a large iron pot. Dried peas that were soaked through the night have been drained and will go into the pot in time, along with whatever vegetables the season and the garden allow, perhaps leeks, perhaps dried root vegetables from the storehouse, perhaps a bundle of dried herbs tied with a length of twine that will simmer in the broth and be removed before serving. The kitchener moves between the hearth and the preparation table with an economy of motion, neither hurried nor slow, his actions shaped by long familiarity with the space and with the quantities required to feed a full monastic community. The sound of the kitchen is different from the silence of the Scriptorium or the church. There is the low, steady voice of the fire, the occasional knock of a wooden implement against the side of a pot, the soft thud of bread dough being worked on a floured board by a lay brother at the far end of the room. But even here the monastery's quality of purposeful quiet prevails, because the work is known, and the steps are ordered, and each action follows the one before it with a calm and dependable logic that governs the rest of the day as well. Across the monastery, in its various rooms and outbuildings and garden spaces, this same quality of steady, purposeful work is present in different forms. The sacrist is attending to the condition of the altar cloths. The younger monk has been set to sweeping the cloister walk. The guest master is preparing a modest chamber for a traveler who is expected. And in the Scriptorium, the pens have been taken up again, and the ink flows once more in its slow and careful lines, and the morning continues in its gentle and coordinated way, each thread of work belonging to a larger fabric, each man in his appointed place, the whole community moving through the hours together. Beyond the cloister walk, through an arched opening in the stone colonnade, lies the cloister Garth, the open square of ground at the heart of the monastery that the covered walkways enclose on all four sides. In some seasons this central square is simply grass, kept low and even, a place of quiet green that catches whatever light the sky offers. But close to the cloister itself, and extending further beyond the main buildings into the more private reaches of the monastery precinct, there are gardens of a more purposeful kind, and it is toward these that the infirmarian makes his way sometime in the mid-morning hours when his other duties allow. The infirmarian is generally a monk of some years and some knowledge, a man who has learned through long practice which plants ease a fever, which brings sleep to a restless body, which reduce the swelling of a joint, and which, prepared carefully as a wash or a poultice, can help a wound to close cleanly. He carries his knowledge the way the scribe carries his command of letters, as something built slowly, practiced daily, held with quiet confidence. And like the scribe, he has a place of work that reflects his purpose, a space laid out with care and maintained through regular attention. The physic garden, sometimes called the herb garden, lies most often close to the infirmary building itself, so that what is needed can be fetched without a long walk through the cold or rain. It is a small and enclosed space, bounded by low stone walls or perhaps by a wooden fence fitted tight to keep out rabbits and other visitors from the surrounding land. Within these boundaries the beds are laid out in careful rows, each one edged with a low border of stone or timber to keep the soil from spreading, and each one planted with a particular herb or group of herbs that has been chosen for its usefulness and tended accordingly. This morning the infirmarian moves along the narrow paths between the beds with steady attention, crouching occasionally to examine a plant more closely, rubbing a leaf between his fingers and raising them briefly to his nose. The scent that rises from this small gesture is sharp and clean, sage first, with its particular dry and almost dusty warmth, the silver-green leaves slightly rough to the touch, the whole plant holding its scent even when only lightly pressed. The sage grows in a wide, low mound, its stems woody at the base and soft and new at the tips, and the infirmarian is checking whether any of those woody stems have grown too old, too thick, too far removed from the living growth at the plant's heart, because sage benefits from cutting back, from having its older wood removed so that the younger growth can flourish. Beside the sage grows rue, a smaller and more delicate plant with leaves of a peculiar blue-green, finely divided, giving the bed a lacy and intricate appearance, quite different from the solidity of the sage beside it. Rue has a bitter, resinous scent, stronger and more pungent than the other herbs nearby, and it is a plant that calls for gentle handling. The infirmarian knows this well, and when he tends the rue he is careful and deliberate, lifting its stems with practiced fingers, checking the soil around its base, removing any dead material from the previous season that has not yet fully broken down. Further along the path, fennel grows tall and feathery, its stems already reaching upward with the characteristic lightness of that plant. Its fine leaves like a green mist above the denser growth of the other beds. Fennel has a sweetness to its scent, something faintly warm and slightly anise-like, and this fragrance drifts pleasantly across the garden when the morning air is still. In a monastery kitchen and infirmary both, fennel finds many uses, its seeds dried and stored, its fresh leaves added to preparations for the stomach, its stems sometimes laid among dried fish to soften the stronger smell of preservation. The infirmarian pauses beside it, notes that it is growing well, and moves on without needing to do more than observe. There is hyssop too, low-growing and somewhat spreading, with small narrow leaves, and in the flowering season, spikes of deep blue-purple blossom that are not yet present this morning but will come in their time. Hyssop is an old plant, one with deep roots in the traditions of monastic medicine and in the scriptures themselves, and it grows in many monastery gardens, as much for its associations as for its practical uses, though those practical uses are real enough. Its qualities and preparations for the chest and throat have long been valued. This morning it sits quietly in its bed, compact and well-rooted, asking for little, except that the soil around it be kept clear, and the infirmarian obliges it, crouching down to draw out a small weed that has established itself at the plant's edge. Lavender grows in a longer bed nearer the wall, and this is perhaps the plant that carries its scent most generously even without being touched, releasing into the still air of the enclosed garden a fragrance that is both soft and persistent, floral and clean, with a slight dryness underneath it that keeps it from being heavy. Even when the lavender is not in flower, the stems and leaves carry that scent, and the bed of it gives the whole garden a particular quality of calm that seems almost independent of any other feature of the place. Bundles of lavender, once cut and dried, will find their way into the dormitory and the infirmary both, laid among linens, placed where the air might carry the scent through a room, used in various preparations for soothing the head and aiding rest. A lay brother works quietly at the far end of the garden this morning, moving methodically along the outer beds with a wooden-handled tool, turning the soil between the established plants in shallow, careful strokes that loosen the earth without disturbing the roots beneath. The soil in a well-maintained herb garden is darker and richer than the general ground of the monastery precinct, because it has been improved over many years with composted plant matter and with whatever other amendments have been available. And this morning it turns up moist and crumbling, fragrant with that deep, slightly sweet smell of earth that has been cared for. Worms turn in the loosened soil and settle again. A small robin has appeared on top of the garden wall, watching the work below with the alert and practical interest that robins always bring to turned ground. The lay brother pauses to collect a handful of weeds he has gathered, carrying them to a pile at the garden's edge that will later be composted or taken to feed the livestock kept on the monastery's land. His work is quiet and even-paced, a steady rhythm of small movements, the shallow stroke of the tool, the slight resistance of the soil, the gathering of unwanted growth, the movement to the next section. It is the kind of work that requires just enough attention to keep the mind present without demanding the deeper concentration of reading or copying. And there is in it a quality of ease, of the body moving through familiar motions in a familiar place. Near the water source, a stone trough fed by a pipe or simply a large bucket filled at the well and carried here. The infirmarian takes up a smaller vessel and begins to water one section of the garden where the soil seems dry, pouring the water slowly at the base of the plants, letting it soak in gradually rather than rushing it across the surface. The sound of water falling onto dry earth is a small and particular sound, half absorbed immediately, the soil darkening around the point of contact and the moisture spreading outward invisibly beneath. The walls of the garden hold in warmth when there is warmth to hold, and they shelter the herbs from the worst of the English wind. The stone of those walls is dark with age, and faintly mossy on the lower courses, and where a wall faces south, small plants establish themselves in cracks without any assistance, finding what they need in the thin deposits of soil and moisture that gather there over years. The enclosed space has a quality of completeness, of a world contained and ordered, where everything present has its purpose and its place. The beds of herbs, the narrow paths, the stone borders, the careful tending of two men who know this garden well, all of it speaks of the same ordering principle that shapes the prayer and the reading and the manuscript work within the buildings that surround this quiet and growing place. The monastery continues its mourning, and here among the herbs, the morning is as full and as purposeful as anywhere within its walls. The bell reaches the herb garden last, or so it seems, its tone arriving softened by the walls and by the open air, blending for a moment with whatever small sounds were already present, the movement of leaves, the settling of a bucket set down on stone. It is the bell for Sext, rung at the 6th hour, and its sound moves through every part of the monastery in the same instant, finding monks at their various occupations and drawing them gently but certainly toward the church. The infirmarian straightens from whatever he has been attending to among his beds of sage and rue, brushes the soil from his hands against the rough cloth of his habit, and turns toward the door that leads back into the cloister walk. The sound of his sandals on the stone joins with other sounds, other footsteps converging from different directions, a slow gathering of the community that happens many times each day and has the ease of long practice. The light at the 6th hour has a particular quality, fuller and more direct than the angled light of morning, falling with a certain weight into the cloister garth, and laying sharp-edged shadows along the stone columns of the arcade. The shadow of each column falls cleanly across the earth of the garth, and where the garth grass grows, it is lit with a brightness that the early morning does not offer. It is the fullest light of the English day, and the monks who walk through the cloister walk toward the church, move through alternating bands of shadow and light, each archway framing a brightness beyond. The church at midday holds its own temperature, cooler than the outer air in warmer months, and the monks file into their choir stalls in the habitual order, the familiar arrangement of community in familiar space. The office of Sext is brief and gentle, shorter than Matins, shorter than Lauds, holding its own character within the day's progression. There are psalms as there always are, the ancient words moving through the choir stalls in the measured cadences of plain chant, one side of the choir singing, and then the other, in the slow antiphonal exchange that has shaped the sound of this church since the community was founded. A short reading follows, and then a hymn, and then prayers, and then a silence that rests over the whole space for a moment, before the abbot or presiding monk offers the closing versicle in response that marks the office complete. The candles on the altar burn through all the hours, their light less visible now against the brightness that enters through the high windows, but present nonetheless, steady in the still air of the church. The smell of the space is a layering of many things accumulated over time: beeswax, incense and faint traces from the morning mass, cool stone, and the particular dry smell of old wood in the choir stalls, worn smooth by years of hands resting there. A monk settling into his stall after a morning of outdoor work carries with him the fainter sense of earth and crushed leaves, and these too become part of the atmosphere of the place, absorbed into it without disruption. When Sext concludes, the community moves with quiet purpose toward the lavatorium, the stone washing basin set in the cloister wall near the entrance to the refectory, fed by a lead pipe from whatever source the monastery draws its water. This washing before the meal is not merely practical but ceremonial in its quality, a small and regular ritual of preparation, of transition from the work of the morning to the gathering of the table. The basin is long enough to accommodate several monks at once, and they wash in turns, the cold water moving over their hands and wrists, the sound of it soft against stone. A rough linen cloth hangs nearby for drying, and each monk passes it between his hands and folds it, or leaves it for the next, without ceremony. There is no speaking. The great silence of Compline has long since lifted, but the monastery is not a place of conversation at will, and approaching the meal, the community moves in the quiet that is their ordinary medium. The refectory stands on the far side of the cloister from the church, a long room with a high ceiling that allows the air to circulate and the voice of the reader to carry without effort. The tables run the length of the room in parallel rows, long boards of plain wood set on trestles, scrubbed by the kitchener's assistants until the grain of the wood stands pale and clean. At each place a wooden bowl has been set, smooth with use and darkened at the rim by years of handling, and beside each bowl a wooden spoon lies with its bowl facing down on the board, and a portion of bread sits nearby, the loaves having been divided in the kitchen before the bell rang. The bread is dark and dense, made from maslin flour, a mixture of wheat and rye such as many households depended upon, and its smell in the enclosed room is good, warm and faintly sour, carrying the particular depth of well-made leavened bread. The community enters and stands at their places along the benches, and the abbot takes his place at the head of the room. The blessing before the meal is spoken by the abbot in the measured tone of a man who has offered these same words many hundreds of times, and the words have been worn smooth by repetition into something very close to chant, carrying the sound of long use and genuine meaning. After the blessing, the community is seated, the sound of benches moving on stone floor, a brief low scrape, and then the meal begins. From the elevated lectern at one end of the room, the appointed reader for the week opens the book that has been placed there and begins in a clear and even voice. The reading during meals is an old practice, one described in the Rule of St. Benedict itself, and it transforms the act of eating from a merely physical necessity into something also of the spirit, the ears and the mind occupied with sacred words, while the hands and mouth attend to nourishment. The reader's voice moves through the refectory at an even pace, the sentences of Scripture or the lives of the saints rising and falling with the natural cadence of the Latin. Absorbed by the walls and the wooden ceiling above, the kitchener and his assistant bring the pottage from the kitchen, carrying the vessel between them and ladling it carefully into the wooden bowls at each place. It is a thick soup of dried peas, perhaps with leeks or onions and whatever garden herbs were available, seasoned modestly with salt, its surface releasing a gentle steam into the air of the refectory. The smell of it fills the room completely, earthy and sustaining, and the warmth of the liquid in a wooden bowl that one holds briefly in both hands before eating is the warmth of a meal that has been prepared with care and attention for the whole community. There is sufficiency here, and that sufficiency has its own form of abundance. The monks eat quietly, the soft sounds of wooden spoons in wooden bowls forming a gentle undercurrent beneath the voice of the reader, and the meal unfolds at its own considered pace, as the monastery's whole day has unfolded, measured, purposeful, and very calm. The pottage is thick and warm, and it settles into the bowl with a quiet weight that speaks of long, slow cooking. The dried peas have been soaking since the evening before, softened through the night in cold water, and then simmered over the kitchen fire through the whole of the working morning until they have broken down into something dense and nourishing, their individual shapes dissolved into a smooth and yielding mass of pale gold and green. The leeks that were added partway through the cooking have softened entirely, their color deepened, their flavor folded gently into the body of the soup, so that the two things, legume and vegetable, have become something unified, something that carries the taste of both without announcing either one too loudly. There is salt, carefully measured, for salt is a valued thing and is not used carelessly, and perhaps a sprig of sage from the herb garden has been laid into the pot during the final hour of cooking, its oils released slowly into the liquid, leaving behind a faint and pleasant earthiness that one tastes more in the warmth rising from the bowl than in any single spoonful. The wooden spoon moves through the pottage and lifts it without hurry. The texture is thick enough that it clings to the spoon for a moment before settling, and the warmth of it in the mouth is gentle and spreading, the kind of warmth that moves through the body gradually, reaching the hands and the chest and the back of the throat with a slow and even steadiness. The monks have been at prayer and work since before the sky held any light, and the body, having moved through so many hours of quiet activity, receives this food with a kind of gratitude that requires no thought and no expression. It is simply felt in the easy way that warmth is felt, and in the way that the muscles of the jaw and the throat find their work in eating to be a natural and restorative rhythm, entirely unlike the effort of the morning. The bread set at each place is dark, made from a mixture of rye and wheat, a maslin loaf of the kind that many households across the region would have known well, with a crust that is firm and a crumb that is dense and slightly moist, carrying the faint sourness that comes from the long fermentation of the dough. The loaves were baked in the monastery's oven in the early morning, and by this hour they have cooled to a pleasant temperature, warm enough still to hold a faint memory of the fire, but cool enough to be broken easily in the hands. The breaking of bread makes a soft sound, a gentle tearing, and the piece held in the hand has a slight springiness to it before it yields entirely. It is good bread, honest bread, made from grain grown and milled and kneaded and baked within the monastic economy, each stage of its production the work of a member of this same community. And it is used to gather the last of the pottage from the bowl, pressing gently along the curved wooden interior until nothing is left behind. The reader at the lectern does not pause. His voice moves steadily through its passage, the Latin syllables measured and clear without being sharp, reaching every part of the long refectory as the room absorbs the sound into its plaster walls and its timber ceiling. The text he reads may be drawn from the Acts of the Apostles, or from the letters of St. Paul, or from the collected lives of the saints whose feast days fall near this week in the monastic calendar, accounts of men and women of great patience and quiet devotion, their stories told in the plain and measured prose of hagiography, which is a prose well suited to a room of this kind and to this particular hour. The words do not demand analysis or response. They are offered to the room as the food is offered to the room, steadily, sufficiently, without urgency, and they are received in the same spirit. Beneath the reader's voice, the sounds of the meal are soft and consistent. The wooden spoon turning in the bowl makes a low, smooth sound, and the setting down of the spoon on the table between mouthfuls produces a small and unremarkable tap that is absorbed almost immediately into the general quiet. The benches creak occasionally as a monk shifts his weight or straightens his back after bending toward his bowl, and these small sounds are entirely without self-consciousness, the ordinary sounds of bodies in a room acknowledged by no one. The ale in the ceramic cups is not cold, but rather the temperature of the room itself, slightly fuller in flavor than the water drawn from the well, dark and mild, not strongly fermented, the kind of drink that sustains without altering, that satisfies a thirst without demanding attention. It is raised and set down with the same quietness with which everything in this room is done. On some days, particularly on the ferias that fall outside periods of fasting, there may be an additional dish brought to the table, a portion of salted fish most likely, dried and preserved from an earlier season, its flesh softened by soaking, and then perhaps warmed in the kitchen with a little water or weak broth until it flakes apart easily, carrying that particular taste of the sea and salt and something deeper beneath both, a taste that is very old and very simple and not unpleasant, in a room where the body is ready to receive it. Or there may be eggs, boiled or baked, brought to the table still warm from the kitchen, their shells peeled away with careful fingers, the white firm and the yolk a deep yellow, rich with a quality that the pottage does not quite have, a different kind of nourishment that the body recognizes and welcomes without ceremony. These additions are not elaborate, and they are not presented as treats or distinctions. They are simply the provision of the day, whatever the kitchen has been able to prepare with what the season and the stores allow, and they are received with the same even gratitude as everything else. The abbot sits at the high table, eating as the others eat, in silence, and his stillness sets a tone for the room that requires no enforcement. The older monks who have sat in this refectory through many hundreds of such meals have a quality of settled ease about them, their bodies accustomed to the bench, their hands accustomed to the spoon and the bowl, their minds free to rest in the words coming from the lectern, or simply in the experience of eating itself, the sensation of warmth and taste, and the gradual easing of hunger. The younger monks learn this ease over time, and it is one of the quieter gifts of the monastic formation, to learn how to eat a meal fully, without distraction or hurry, to be entirely present to a bowl of pottage and a piece of bread, in a way that makes those simple things something more than they might otherwise seem. The light that falls through the refectory windows at this hour is the fullest light of the day, the midday light that comes in at a high angle and crosses the room in broad, pale bands, picking out the grain of the wooden table, the uneven surface of the plaster on the opposite wall, the slight movement of steam still rising from the bowl. There is no decoration in this room beyond what is functional. The long tables, the benches, the lectern, the small raised table from which the abbot presides. And in that plainness the light itself becomes the ornament, moving slowly across the surfaces as the meal continues, marking the passage of the hour in its own gradual way. When the meal is finished, the bowls and spoons are gathered quietly, and the monks sit for a moment in that particular stillness that follows eating, a stillness that is different in quality from the stillness of prayer or the stillness of work. It is the stillness of the body satisfied, of attention released, of the small and necessary act of nourishment completed. The reader at the lectern finishes his passage and closes his book with a soft and considered sound, and the abbot gives a brief signal, and the community rises from the benches with the slow and easy movement of men who have nowhere to be except where they will be next, and who find that that is entirely enough. The benches are pushed in, the tables left clean and bare, and the monks move in a quiet procession back through the door of the refectory and into the cloister walk, where the midday light falls across the stone flags in long rectangles, and the air is cool and still after the warmth and the smell of the meal. The community has been fed as it is fed every day at this hour, simply and fully and in silence, and the gratitude that accompanies that feeding is not spoken aloud, but is carried in the pace and quietness of the men as they pass through the cloister, each carrying within him the warmth of a meal prepared with care, eaten in the company of others, and offered as part of a day given entirely over to an ordered and abiding peace. The cloister walk receives the community as it always does. Its long corridor of arched stone open on one side to the Garth, where the small square of enclosed garden holds its herbs and its silence beneath the pale midday sky. The monks move without hurry through this familiar passage, and gradually, as the procession disperses, each man finds his way toward the rest that the rule of Saint Benedict has appointed for this hour. In the warmer months especially, when the days are long and the morning's labor has begun before the sun was fully risen, the period following the midday meal is given over to a sanctioned and unhurried stillness. Some monks will make their way up to the dormitory, climbing the day stairs with a slow and careful tread, and they will lie down upon their straw pallets still dressed, pulling a woolen blanket loosely over themselves, letting the quiet of the long room settle around them. The dormitory in the early afternoon is a different place than it is at the deep hours of night. The light comes through the narrow windows in pale bars, falling across the wooden partition boards and the rolled edges of blankets, and the sounds that drift up from the monastery below are gentle and intermittent, the creak of a door somewhere, the distant sound of water, a bird song entering from beyond the walls. It is a light and restorative sleep when it comes, not the deep unconsciousness of night, but a gentle loosening of the body's held tensions, the legs growing heavy, the breathing slowing, the thoughts dissolving into something soft and formless. Other monks will choose not to climb to the dormitory at all, but will remain in the cloister walk, settling onto the low stone bench that runs along the inner wall, their backs against the cool stone, their eyes perhaps half open on the garden Garth. A monk sitting in this way in the cloister after the midday meal is neither quite awake nor quite asleep, but inhabits a middle state that the body knows well, the state of rest without absence, of quietness without vacancy. The light in the Garth moves almost imperceptibly as the sun shifts in its arc above, and the herbs in their beds release a faint warmth into the still air, and a monk on the cloister bench may notice this without attending to it, the way one notices the sound of one's own breathing without thinking of it as a thing noticed. Gradually, in the measure of time that the rule assigns, the rest begins to lift. There is no abruptness to this, no sudden return to purpose, but rather a slow re-engagement, the way water settles after it has been disturbed. Monks rise from their pallets, or straighten from the cloister bench, smooth their habits with their hands, and move back into the flow of the afternoon's work with an easy and unhurried calm. Men, for whom rest and labor are not opposites, but two expressions of the same ordered life. The work of the afternoon takes many forms, and the monastery in these hours is a place of gentle and distributed industry, each monk attending to the task assigned to him by the abbot or the prior, each task small in itself, and yet part of the larger whole that keeps the community fed and sheltered and supplied. In the kitchen garden beyond the main buildings, lay brothers and perhaps one or two of the choir monks move along the rows of cultivated ground with spades and hoes, turning the soil around the roots of vegetables, clearing the paths between the beds of the weeds that grow with patient persistence through every season. The earth here is dark and well tended, and it gives off a cool mineral smell when it is turned, mixed with the green scent of broken stems and the faint sweetness of composted matter worked back into the ground over many years. The sound of a hoe moving through soil is a soft and repetitive sound, neither loud nor jarring, a rhythm that settles into the background of the afternoon the way birdsong does, present and undemanding. Near the outer buildings, a monk tasked with the care of supplies makes his way along a covered passage, carrying a heavy sack of dried beans from the storehouse toward the kitchen, moving slowly under the weight, his sandals quiet on the worn stone beneath him. The cellarer, whose responsibility extends across every provision of the house, moves through his domain with careful attention, checking the levels in the grain jars, noting what will need to be replenished, lifting the cloth from a crock of salt to confirm its condition. These are small acts, attended to with the same quality of presence that the singing of psalms requires, because in the monastic understanding of work, all labor rightly done is offered as part of the same continuous prayer, and a monk counting dried beans in a stone storeroom is not doing something lesser than a monk chanting in the choir, but something equally whole. In one of the outbuildings, a monk with a talent for practical repair is working on a section of wooden furniture that has grown loose in its joinery, a bench from the refectory perhaps, or a reading desk from the chapter house. He sits with the piece before him, examining it with a calm and patient eye, pressing the loose joint with his hand to understand its movement, then preparing the material he will use to set it firm again. The motions of this work are slow and considered, the careful application of pressure, the patient holding of one part against another while the repair takes hold, and the monk gives it no more and no less attention than it requires, which is to say, his full attention, steady and untroubled. Elsewhere, a monk assigned to copying, who did not complete his morning's portion in the Scriptorium, returns to his desk in the afternoon light, which is now coming from a different angle than it did in the morning hours, and falls across his parchment in a way that is softer and more diffuse. He settles himself, trims the nib of his quill with a small practiced movement, and draws the text before him a little closer, finding the line where he left off. The scratch of the quill resumes, and the words accumulate on the page once more, one after another, with the slow and careful patience that the work demands. There is a particular quality to the afternoon hours in the Scriptorium, a quality of deepening concentration, as though the body, having been fed and rested, now gives its attention to the mind's work with a greater willingness, a greater ease. Outside the walls, in the orchard that belongs to the monastery, the low sound of wind moves through the upper branches of the apple and pear trees, and a lay brother walking beneath them on some errand pauses for a moment, not from tiredness, but from the simple and involuntary pleasure of standing among trees in the afternoon, the light sifted through leaves and falling on his face and hands in shifting patterns. He does not linger long, there is work yet to return to, but the pause is its own small completion, the sort of moment that the day affords without announcement, offering a brief and wordless sufficiency before the work continues. And the work does continue, in all its forms across the afternoon's slow passage of time, each monk engaged in his portion of it, with a steadiness that is neither hurried nor reluctant. The body moves through its tasks, lifting, carrying, pressing, cutting, writing, tending, and the mind follows, settling into the rhythm of the hands the way water settles into the shape of whatever holds it. There is a kind of meditation in this, not spoken or formal, but present nonetheless in the way the breath moves with exertion, in the way attention narrows to the thing directly before one, in the way the afternoon itself seems to slow and deepen as the work goes on, drawing the whole community forward together through the ordered hours toward the bell that will sound again in its time. The bell, when it comes, does not startle. It arrives, as bells in this place always arrive, as something expected, something already folded into the quiet rhythm of the day, so that the monks who are working in the garden, or moving through the cloister, or bent over their tasks in one room or another, feel it almost before they hear it, a readiness already forming in the shoulders and the hands. This is the bell for non, the office of the 9th hour, and it draws the community in from the afternoon's scattered occupations with the same gentle authority that has gathered them so many times before through the long turning of the day. The church receives them in its particular afternoon quiet. By the 9th hour, the light inside has shifted considerably from what it was at Terce or Sext, and the change is not merely a matter of brightness or dimness, but of angle and texture and color, a transformation so gradual that no single moment reveals it, and yet the accumulated difference is wholly plain. The high windows on the south side of the nave, which in the morning caught and threw broad, pale oblongs of light across the floor tiles, now cast their illumination at a shallower angle, so that the light falls not downward so much as sideways, touching the upper portions of the columns and the carved stone capitals with a warm and slightly golden quality that was not there before. The carved foliage on those capitals, the curling leaves, the occasional small face peering from among stone vines, the geometric interlace worked by some mason's patient hand, receives this afternoon light differently than it receives the light of morning, the shadows falling into the carving from a changed direction, so that forms which were flat and dim in early light now stand out with a gentle relief, each leaf and curl made more plainly itself. Across the tiled floor of the presbytery, where the altar stands, and the candles wait unlit in the afternoon, the same sideways light traces the edges of the glazed tiles, the ochre and dark green and deep red of them, and brings out the subtle variation of their color in a way that earlier hours do not. A monk taking his place in the choir stalls notices this, or perhaps does not notice it with any conscious attention, and yet his eyes rest for a moment on the floor, and the quality of rest in that brief glance is perhaps deepened by what the light has made of ordinary things. The high east window, which in the morning hours blazed with whatever pale or golden light the sky afforded, is now in relative shadow, the exterior world beyond its stone tracery having moved away from the sun's direct gift, and so the window presents a cooler, quieter face to the interior, its stone mullions standing in soft gray outline against a sky that through the thick old glass appears a muted and peaceful blue. The monks arrange themselves in their choir stalls, and the office of non begins in the customary way, opening with the versicle in response, the voices finding one another in that easy unanimity born of long practice. The hymn is sung, short and steady, its melody neither elaborate nor plain, worn smooth by repetition into something that sits comfortably in the throat and chest, and then the psalms follow, 3 or 4 of them appointed for this hour, their ancient words moving through the church in the chanted tones that have carried them here day after day through all the years this community has gathered. There is something in the afternoon quality of none that differs subtly from the earlier offices, though the structure is much the same. The voices of the monks carry perhaps a certain weight of the day already accomplished, the morning's labor and study, the midday meal and its brief rest, the afternoon's work now interrupted, and this weight is not heaviness exactly, but rather fullness, a sense of the day having been inhabited completely up to this point, of much having passed through hands and minds since the dark hours of Matins. The prayers at the close of none are brief and earnest in their brevity. A short reading, a response, the final collect spoken or sung by the priest in his order, and then the community rises and moves out from the choir in its customary silence, the figures dispersing into the cloister with the easy, settled manner of men who know well where they are going. In certain seasons of the year, and according to the customs of the house, a lighter meal may follow none, a collation, modest in its portions and simple in its composition, taken either in the refectory or in some neighboring space as the hour and the season allow. In the longer days of late spring or summer, when the working hours stretch further and the evening meal follows after more work has been accomplished, this small refreshment in the afternoon serves as a quiet provision for the body, a recognition that the day's remaining hours require their own sustaining. A cup of something warm or cool water from the stone vessel, a portion of bread remaining from the midday baking, perhaps a little cheese or fruit according to what the season and the cellar's provisions allow. These things are set out without ceremony, received without ceremony, and consumed with the same attentiveness and quiet gratitude that accompanies every act of eating in this place. The bread, if it is from the morning's baking, has settled into itself by this hour, its crust no longer warm, but firm and pleasant between the fingers, its interior soft and faintly sour, in the way of bread made with a long-worked leaven. The cheese, if there is cheese, is simple and pale, cut into small portions, its flavor mild and clean. The water or the small measure of ale carries a coolness that the afternoon, even in its warmth, has not entirely overcome, and the drinking of it is its own quiet pleasure, the throat receiving it gratefully after the dusty work of the afternoon hours. The monks eat with the usual stillness, without conversation, the small meal passing quickly and without occasion, and yet the quality of the pause it offers is not small. The body is gathered back to itself for a little while, acknowledged and provided for, and this acknowledgment has a calmness to it that spreads through the remaining hours of the day like water spreading quietly across a level surface, reaching into all the small spaces of what is still to come, the evening's offices and reading and final gathering, the long soft descent of the day toward its rest. The light that falls across the cloister Garth in the late afternoon has been changing for some time, before any single moment announces itself as the turn-in of the day. It has been withdrawing slowly, pulling back from the upper reaches of the stone walls, thinning along the flagged paths, deepening in the angles between arches. The shadows that lay at noon in compressed, modest pools have been lengthening across the whole afternoon, stretching eastward across the grass of the Garth, reaching toward the far cloister walk with a gradual and patient purpose that asks nothing of anyone who notices them. The sky above the open square of the Garth has shifted from its midday brightness to a softer, more considered tone, palest at the horizon, in whatever direction the sun has begun to settle, deeper and more collected overhead. There is in this light something that the body recognizes without being told, a sense that the active portion of the day is drawing its work together toward a close. The bell, when it sounds for Vespers, falls into this quietening atmosphere with a particular quality, different in some way from the bells of the earlier hours, which rang across a day still full of its own momentum and possibility. This bell sounds across a day that has done what it set out to do. The monks in the kitchen garden, who have been lifting the last of the afternoon's tasks from their hands, straighten themselves, set aside whatever they have been holding, and begin to move toward the church. The kitchener, attending to preparations for the evening, adjusts and sets aside, covers what should be covered, and follows the same slow pull toward the sound. Those who have been sitting quietly in the cloister walk with a book across their knees, reading until the light became too uncertain for comfortable use, close the volume with the particular care given to all books in this place, and rise, settling their habits around them as they stand. They move through the cloister, the soft tread of sandals on stone accompanying them as it has accompanied every movement of this long day, a sound that is by now almost indistinguishable from the ambient life of the monastery itself, as natural as the wind working gently through the Garth or the settling of old timber in the roof spaces. The church door receives them one by one, and they enter into a space that is in the act of transformation, still holding the gray blue of late afternoon through its high windows, but already beginning to receive the warmer, closer light of flame. The lighting of the candles for Vespers is a deliberate and careful task, assigned to a member of the community with the care that attaches to all liturgical duties. The acolyte or sacristan moves through the church with a taper, a long, slender thing from which a small, bright point of flame extends, and visits each candlestick in turn. The altar candles are lit first, the tallest ones, their wax pale and smooth, their wicks drawing the flame upward with a quiet steadiness, and then settling into the still, upright burn that is the proper character of a well-made candle in still air. The light they cast is warm, where the afternoon light through stone windows is cool, and this warmth begins immediately to change the character of the space, drawing in the walls, pooling color from the painted apse or the gilded vessel on the altar, laying soft amber across the carved stonework that runs along the choir stalls. Other lights follow in their order. The oil lamps that hang from iron fittings or stand on brackets along the nave are attended to with equal care, their wicks trimmed if they have been burning earlier in the day, or newly set to flame if this is the first lighting of the evening. The oil in these lamps is of good quality, pressed from seeds or rendered cleanly, and it burns with a steady, quiet flame that does not gutter or smoke when the air is still. Together, the candles on the altar and the lamps distributed through the space create a complete illumination that is nothing like the broad clarity of daylight, and everything like something warmer and more intimate, a world gathered close around its own light, comfortable with the darkness that now begins to press at the windows. The monks in their choir stalls wait while this lighting is completed. They sit or stand in the half-dark, already present, already drawing themselves inward toward the office that is about to begin. There is a particular quality to this waiting, not impatience, never that, in this place, but a kind of collected stillness, the day's accumulated work settling in the body, like sediment settling in a jar of water that has been at last set down and left to find its own quiet. Vespers is among the longer and more elaborate of the daily offices, and its chanting carries a fullness appropriate to the hour. The opening versicle sounds, and the voices of the community respond, and from that first exchange the psalmody opens out into the evening air of the church. There are 5 psalms appointed for Vespers, their texts familiar to every monk from years of repetition, committed not merely to memory in the ordinary sense, but to something deeper, into the body itself, and to the rhythm of breath, so that the words arise not as recalled text, but as something more closely resembling breath or heartbeat. The antiphons that frame each psalm give the evening office its particular seasonal color, changing through the year in accordance with the liturgical calendar, marking the great feasts and the ordinary weeks in turn, so that even in its repetition the office is never entirely the same from one evening to the next, but is always the same in its deepest nature. The voices rise into the stone vault above the choir. In a monastery of any size, the vault receives sound with a generosity that gives the chanting a quality the individual voices alone could not produce, adding to each phrase a faint reverberance that does not muddy the words but extends them slightly, allows them to linger a moment longer in the air before releasing them. The effect is one of great spaciousness, a sense that the words are not confined to the throats and mouths of those who sing them, but fill the entire volume of the church, reaching into the transepts, into the side chapels, into all the corners where the candlelight does not quite reach. A chapter from Scripture is read aloud in the measured tone that all readings receive in this place, even and without emphasis beyond what the text itself carries. A hymn is sung, and then the Magnificat, the great canticle of the evening office, its ancient words given their full solemnity with the lighting of additional incense if the season calls for it. The fragrant smoke rising through the candlelit air in slow, soft columns. The Magnificat brings Vespers toward its close with a sense of gentle completion. The final prayers are spoken, the blessing is given, and the community stands for a moment in the warm quiet of the lamplit church before the office formally concludes and the monks begin to move again through the familiar motions of dispersal. What follows Vespers is a quietened cloister, the day's working portion fully given over now, the light outside the windows reduced to the last pale gray that precedes full dark. The monks move through the walks with the easy steadiness of men whose bodies know the shape of the evening ahead, whose feet carry them without particular instruction toward wherever the next quiet task or moment of rest awaits. A lamp may be tended in the chapter house, a door latched, a tool set in its proper place in the outhouse or the garden shed. These are small, final gestures, the day's work folded away with the same care with which the vestments are folded and laid in the sacristy chest. The smell of candle smoke follows the monks out of the church and into the cloister, a clean, warm scent that mingles with the cooler evening air and lingers gently at the threshold between church and cloister walk. It is a smell that belongs particularly to this hour, to this transition between the lit warmth of the church and the dimming of the world outside it, and any monk of long standing would know it instantly, as the smell of the day's labor completed and offered, gathered into the chanting that has just been given, and now released, drifting away on the cool air of a monastery evening, the whole long day folding softly into the hours that remain. The community does not disperse entirely after Vespers. There is still one more gathering before the silence of night descends. One more moment of shared quietness that draws the monks together before Compline closes the day. This gathering is known as the Collatio, a word that carries within it the sense of something brought together, collected, offered in common. And it takes its name, by long tradition, from the conferences of John Cassian, the writings of that careful chronicler and interpreter whose reflections on the inner life of the monk have been read in monasteries across the centuries, with the same patient reverence given to Scripture itself. In the cooler months, when the evenings come early, and the stone of the cloister holds a particular chill that settles into cloth and bone alike, the community may be permitted to gather in the warming room, the calefactory, which is one of the few places in the monastery where a fire is regularly kept. It is not a large fire, nor is it intended for anything beyond what the rule allows, simple warmth against the cold of an English winter evening. But its presence changes the quality of the gathering entirely. The light in the warming room at this hour is different from the candlelight of the church. Lower, more amber, more unsteady, the flames moving gently with the breath of the room and throwing soft, shifting patterns across the faces of the men who settle near it. The fire itself is built of seasoned wood, stacked earlier by a lay brother or a junior monk charged with this quiet domestic task, and it has by now burned down to a steady, generous heat, the logs reduced to a deep glow at their hearts, the occasional small flame rising and subsiding without drama. The monks take their places around the room in whatever arrangement the space and custom allow, some seated on stone benches along the walls, others on simple wooden stools brought in for the purpose. There is a looseness to the gathering that belongs to the hour, a collective easing of posture that would not be visible in the choir or the chapter house. These are men who have been at their work in prayer since before dawn, who have carried the full weight of the monastic day in their bodies as well as their spirits, and the warmth of the room reaches them with a gentleness that is almost palpable. Shoulders settle, hands rest quietly in laps or folded within the wide sleeves of habits. Eyes, grown accustomed to the long effort of reading or outdoor labor, relax in the softer light. In certain seasons in certain houses, a small measure of something warm may be given at this gathering. A cup of warmed ale, or perhaps water heated and touched with a little honey, passed quietly from the kitchener or a novice charged with the task, each cup received with a small bow, held in both hands, in the manner of something received rather than simply taken. The warmth of the cup against the palms is its own small comfort, and the monks hold it without hurry while the reader settles into place. The reader for the Collatio is appointed, as so many tasks are appointed in the monastery, by rotation or by the abbot's designation, and the person chosen on any given evening takes their place with a certain quiet gravity, understanding that this reading is not a performance, but a gift of attention offered to the community at the close of the day. The text chosen is most often a passage from the conferences of John Cassian, those long and careful conversations between the young monks Cassian and his companion Germanus and the desert fathers of Egypt, full of counsel about prayer, humility, the wandering of the mind, and the slow and patient work of the interior life. The language, even in Latin, has a particular rhythm to it, measured and deliberate, suited to this hour of diminishing light and growing stillness. The reader's voice fills the room without straining. It is a low voice, even and steady, the kind of voice that does not call attention to itself, but simply carries the words forward, one sentence settling after another like water moving across stone. The listening monks do not follow the text with their eyes. There is only the one book, held by the one reader, and so the words arrive purely as sound, as meaning carried on breath, and the mind receives them in a manner quite different from the active reading of the Scriptorium or the antiphonal exchange of the choir. The listening is passive, receptive, the mind moving gently with the current of the sentences without the need to hold or direct them. Around the reader, the room breathes quietly. The fire shifts and settles. A monk near the wall adjusts his position on the bench. The smell of wood smoke is close and warm, mingling with the faint scent of wool and tallow that always inhabits a room where many people have gathered. Outside, beyond the thick walls, the English evening has deepened into full dark, the cloister Garth lying in a stillness that feels total and settled in the winter months. The sky above the open square of the Garth, holding perhaps a pale scattering of stars, though no one is there to see them. Sleepiness by this hour has settled into the monks in a way that is not uncomfortable, but rather fitting, the body's own response to a day honestly lived from its earliest dark hour to its present dimming. The heaviness in the eyelids, the loosening of muscles, the way the warm cup in the hands becomes an anchor to simple present sensation. All of this is the body preparing itself, without urgency, for the rest that lies only a little further ahead. The Collatio does not resist this settling, it accommodates it, even honors it, offering the mind something gentle to move alongside as the day's full weight is quietly released. When the reader comes to the natural end of the appointed passage, the voice ceases without fanfare. A brief silence follows, open and complete, the kind of silence that does not ask to be filled. The cups, if they have been given, are collected with the same quiet care with which they were distributed. The fire has burned lower still, its light now barely reaching the far corners of the room, and in that diminished warmth, with the stillness of the passage still present in the air, the community rests for one more moment in the simplest form of togetherness, men gathered without words, at the end of a long day, before the last prayer of the night calls them gently to their feet once more. The bell for Compline sounds softly into that gathered stillness, and the community rises without haste, the movement of standing coming slowly through bodies that have been sitting quietly for some while. Sandals find the floor, habits are settled around shoulders that have grown accustomed to the warmth of nearness. The monks move from wherever they have been gathered, from the cloister walk, from the warming room, from the low light of the Collatio's last moments, and make their way toward the church in the manner they have walked this path every evening of their lives in this place. Quietly, without urgency, each man carrying the calm of the reading still with him. The church receives them in candlelight. Several candles have been lit and set in place before the office begins, their flames burning with a steadiness that belongs to sheltered interiors, undisturbed by any movement of air from the outside world. The altar candles glow at the far end of the nave, and smaller lights mark the choir stalls, each one casting its small warm circle against the cool stone beyond it. The cumulative light of Compline is gentler than that of any other office, not the deep darkness of Matins, where candles barely suggest the vast height of the vaulted ceiling, but a softer, more collected warmth that seems to draw inward rather than illuminate outward. The church feels smaller at this hour, more enclosed, more intimate, as though the building itself has drawn in a long breath and settled. The monks take their places in the choir stalls, the carved wooden seats familiar to each man's body after years of the same gesture, the slight lowering, the arrangement of folded hands, the bowing of the head. The abbot standing at his stall begins the office in a low and even voice, and the community answers him. The psalms of Compline are few, and they are the same psalms sung every evening without variation, so that each monk has long since absorbed them into memory. The words come from the lips gently without the effort of searching. Like water moving along a channel it has followed for a very long time. The psalm most closely associated with this hour, the 91st, with its images of shelter and quiet dwelling, moves through the church in the measured cadence of plain chant, the voices neither hurrying nor lingering, but following the ancient melodic pattern with the care of men who understand that repetition is not tedium, but deepening. The sound rises into the stone vault above and settles there, and the silence that follows each verse has its own quality, the kind of silence that exists only inside singing and is made fuller by it. After the psalmody and the brief reading, the hymn is sung, and then the canticle known as the Nunc Dimittis, the Song of Simeon, those few verses in which an old man holds what he has waited long to receive and finds himself ready at last to rest. It is a fitting close to a day, and it has been sung at this hour for centuries in monasteries across England and the whole of Christendom, chosen for precisely this reason. The words are few, the melody is simple, but in the darkened church, with the day fully accomplished, and the flames burning steadily on the altar, the verses carry a weight of completeness, of arriving at a proper end. Then comes the Salve Regina, the antiphon to the Virgin, its Latin syllables moving through the choir in a melody of considerable tenderness. In some communities this antiphon is sung with particular care at Compline, the voices softening further at its conclusion, as though the song itself is settling toward sleep. The stone vault holds the sound long after the voices have ceased, a faint resonance that fades so gradually it is impossible to say precisely when the silence has returned. The blessing with holy water follows. The abbot moves through the choir with the vessel and the sprinkler, and each monk bows his head as the abbot pauses before him. The water is cool and the gesture is brief, a small movement of the hand, a faint sound, a moment of acknowledgement that is both formal and deeply personal. The abbot continues along the row with patience and care, and each monk who has been blessed returns to stillness, head still slightly inclined. When the abbot has moved through the whole community, he returns to his place and gives the final blessing, his voice low, the Latin phrases of dismissal and peace spoken without particular ceremony, but with the full weight of long habit and sincere intention. And then the great silence falls. It falls not like something imposed from outside, but like something that has been present all along, beneath the day's necessary sounds, now simply allowed to rise to the surface and be felt. No voice will be raised again until after Matins, and every monk understands this as he rises from his stall. The silence is a shared thing, held between them all, and the very care with which each man moves, the deliberateness of footfall, the quietness of breath, is a form of keeping it. The candles on the altar are extinguished one by one, and the church returns to near darkness. The monks file out through the night stairs, the same stairs they descended in the small hours of the night before, and will descend again before many hours have passed. The stone steps are worn smooth in the center, from the passage of many feet over many years, and the candlelight carried by the one who leads the way throws a moving shadow that climbs the wall ahead of the procession before disappearing around the turn of the stair. The dormitory is long and low-ceilinged, and the narrow windows along its outer wall admit no light at this hour, only a faint suggestion of the darkness beyond the glass. Each monk goes to his pallet, a simple frame supporting a mattress of straw, with a wool blanket folded across it, and perhaps a second for the colder months. He sets down his candle, if he has carried one, and it may be that this small flame is the last light in the room, burning for only a moment longer before it too is extinguished. The settling is gradual. A pallet shifts beneath weight, a blanket is drawn upward and arranged with quiet care. Somewhere in the dormitory, a timber in the roof gives a slow creak as the night outside cools further, and the sound is absorbed by the silence without disturbing it. A distant wind moves against the outer walls, not strong, only a low and steady presence that has been there since evening, and will remain through the night hours, passing around the corners of the church tower and through the branches of whatever trees stand beyond the precinct wall. The last candle, wherever it burns, spends itself slowly. The flame narrows, sways once without any evident cause, and then is gone, leaving behind it only the deep quiet of the room. The dormitory is now held entirely in the dark, and the breathing of the monks, each man already moving toward sleep, the body carrying him there with the same patient certainty with which the bell has carried them through every office of the day, becomes the only sound in the room that is distinctly itself, the rest being only the wind and the settled quiet of old stone. The day has reached its end. The prayers have been said. The work of the hands and the mind has been completed and offered. The silence that now surrounds the sleeping community is not empty, but full of everything that has been done and sung and read and tended and made, from the moment the first bell rang in the dark hours before dawn until this final extinguishing of flame. It is a silence that has been earned through a whole day of purposeful, careful living, and it holds the monastery and all within it in something that feels very much like peace. The monastery rests now in the fullness of night, and every building within its precinct walls is held in the same deep, unhurried stillness. The great silence has settled over everything, over the church with its high stone vaults, over the cloister walk with its long shadows, over the Scriptorium and the Refectory and the infirmary and the herb garden. And the darkness that fills each of these spaces is not the darkness of absence, but something richer and more particular, the darkness of a place that is known, that has been walked through and tended and prayed in and worked within across the whole long arc of the day now completed. The church stands as it has always stood in these deep hours, its walls thick enough that the cold of the English night settles into them slowly and departs from them slowly in turn. Inside, the altar candles have long been extinguished, and only the small sanctuary lamp continues its quiet vigil, its flame so steady and so small that it seems less like burning and more like a quality of the air itself, a faint warmth of orange light that touches the nearest stonework and leaves everything beyond it in soft obscurity. The choir stalls are empty, their carved wooden seats folded up, or resting in whatever position the last monk to leave them allowed. And the stone floor of the nave is cool and entirely silent. The psalms that were sung here many hours ago, at Matins, at Lauds, at Prime, at Terce, at Sext, at Nun, at Vespers, at Compline, have long since dissolved into the air, and yet there is a sense, present in any very old building that has absorbed centuries of repeated sound, that the stones themselves hold something of what has passed within them. The vaulting overhead, the thick columns, the worn threshold of the door through which so many feet have passed, all of it has received, across more years than any single life can encompass, the same sequences of prayer offered in the same hours, winter and summer, in illness and in health, in grief and in contentment alike. The cloister walk is entirely still. The Garth at its center, that small square of enclosed earth with its low plantings and its central well or cross, is lost to view in the darkness, though the shape of it is present to the mind as a kind of steadiness at the heart of the buildings. The stone bench along one walk where a monk might sit in the afternoon light to read is cold now, and the paving underfoot holds the chill of the season in its smooth, worn surface. Earlier in the day this walk was the passage between purpose and purpose, between the dormitory and the church, between the chapter house and the Scriptorium, between prayer and work, and prayer again, and the measured sound of sandals moving across stone was heard here many dozens of times. And the silence of the cloister has the quality of something fulfilled, rather than something interrupted. The Scriptorium is dark, as it must be at this hour, its tall windows admitting only the faint and formless gray of a clouded night sky. The writing desks stand at their angles, unoccupied, and the small clay or iron pots that hold the ink have been stoppered against drying. Quill pens lie where they were set down at the end of the working morning, their trim nibs still faintly stained. The parchment pages on which monks labored through the long, careful hours of the forenoon are set aside, held flat, waiting with complete patience for the work to continue tomorrow when the light returns. The smell of the room is faint but still present, something of oak gall ink, something of scraped animal skin prepared to a fine smoothness, something of the beeswax used to dress the surface of boards. And these are the smells of work that was done slowly and with attention, work that was itself understood as a form of prayer, the careful hand moving across the page as a kind of offering. The refectory is long and quiet, its trestle tables bare now, and its benches pushed close. The wooden bowls and spoons that were laid out with such practical care before the midday meal have been washed and put away, and the lectern from which the appointed reader read aloud while the community ate stands at one end of the room in the dark, holding whatever text was open there, its pages invisible. The memory of the meal, the pottage, the bread, the small measure of ale, the quiet sounds of the room punctuated by that steady reading voice, belongs to the middle of the day that has now passed entirely, and the room itself seems content to hold that memory without needing to do anything further with it. The infirmary in its separate building, set a little apart so that those who rest there might have additional quiet, is still. The infirmarian checked upon those in his care before retiring for the night, adjusting coverings, ensuring warmth, leaving within reach whatever was needed, moving through the room with the practiced gentleness of a man long accustomed to the work of care. Those resting in the infirmary sleep with whatever ease their condition permits, and the herbs gathered and prepared by careful hands over many seasons, dried and stored in bundles and small jars, drawn upon for tisanes and poultices and treatments gentle in their application, continue their slow and modest work. The herb garden lies still beneath the night sky, its low borders and careful rows invisible in the darkness, but present in their established order. The sage is there, and the rue, and the fennel with its tall dried stems, and the hyssop and the lavender whose fragrance, released in warmth and handled into the hands during the day's tending, lingers in the memory of the garden even in the cold. The soil between the planted rows holds the moisture of the day's watering, and the stone border that encircles the garden is cold and solid and enduring. By day, this small enclosed space receives whatever light the English sky allows and returns it in green and silver and gray according to the season. By night, it is simply itself, quiet and purposeful in its rest, as everything else within the precinct is quiet and purposeful in rest. The kitchen is dark and cool, the great hearth reduced to embers that will be banked until morning. The ladles and the heavy iron pots, the wooden paddles and the rough-woven cloths, all are set in their places and await the kitchener who will return to them before the community requires its next meal. The cellar below holds its barrels and its stores in the same steady dark as everything else, and the provisions laid by, the dried fish, the beans, the barrels of ale in their patient fermentation, the salt in its container, the cheese wrapped against the air, rest in their ordered abundance, sufficient for tomorrow and the days beyond. All of this, the church, the cloister, the scriptorium, the refectory, the garden, the kitchen, the cellar, the chapter house, the warming room, the guest quarters near the gatehouse, has been inhabited throughout this day by the same orderly rhythm. It is a rhythm that did not begin with any monk now sleeping in the dormitory, and it will not end with them. The rule of Saint Benedict set down many centuries before the present day prescribed this sequence of prayer and work and reading and rest with a completeness and a clarity that has allowed communities of monks to order their lives by it across generation after generation. The same hours have been sung, the same psalms have been returned to in their appointed rotation, the same silence has fallen after Compline in monasteries across England, in the fens, in the wooded Midlands, on the northern moors, in river valleys, beside the sea, and this particular monastery, with its particular stones and its particular community, is one place among many in which this same ancient and steady pattern has been entrusted to human lives and human voices. The dormitory is quiet. The long room with its rows of straw-filled pallets and its woolen blankets holds the sleeping community in a warmth that is collective, the accumulated warmth of many bodies in a shared space, which is its own gentle comfort against the cold of stone and English night. Each monk lies as he came to rest after Compline, still fully clothed and girded as the rule prescribes. The day's weariness, the early rising, the cold of the night office, the long hours of work, the careful attention of prayer, repeated 7 times and more through the turning hours, having drawn him smoothly and certainly into sleep. The breathing of the community is deep and even, settled and regular as everything else within these walls, and the dormitory holds that breathing as the church holds its silence, as the cloister holds the stillness of the Garth at its center. The night watchman sits where he has sat through the deep hours, keeping his lamp trimmed so that its flame burns steadily and clear. He will note the passing of the hours by whatever means the community has established, by a water clock, by the careful marking of a candle, by long familiarity with the quality of darkness and the faint sounds of the world beyond the walls, and in due course he will rise and ring the bell that calls the sleeping monks back to the church for Matins, and the day will begin again as it has always begun, in darkness, in cold, in the quiet gathering of sleepy men around the ancient words of the Psalms. But that bell has not yet rung. The night holds its depth, the lamp burns, the stones rest in their centuries of accumulated stillness, gathered in the ordered peace of a life given its full shape by prayer and work, and the patient return of each hour to its proper offering. And the monastery rests around them, dark and full and complete, in the long and quiet continuing of the night.